Thank you all so much for being here. I've never been excited to talk about incorporation and legal structure before, but big fan of everyone in this room and very much looking forward to what it is we're building. And how we incorporate and where we incorporate is obviously an important part of that. So we'll start with some introductions, and then this is just an organic conversation to help us land more on the right answer. We may not come out of the conversation today with like a perfect solution, but as long as we've got some directions to further explore, that's perfect. So from the top, in alphabetical order, we've got Matt Dearden, highly sought after business attorney and TikTok creator, adept at breaking down complex legal concepts. You can find him at Matt Dearden 49 on TikTok. Would highly recommend checking him out. We've got Mike Feerick, internationally recognized leader in social entrepreneurship, CEO of Allison, which is an education platform with 50 million users. He has provided tens of millions of people with free education, and you can learn more at allison.com. We've also got Sam Radakia. Am I saying your last name right?
Radakia.
Radakia. All right. Sam Radakia. Futurist, speaker, skydiver, Forex tech entrepreneur, Forbes 30 Under 30, and best-selling author. In fact, she just had her latest book come out last week, Radical Next, Reclaiming Your Humanity in a Post-Human World. It reached #1 in all 3 of its categories the day of release, and we've already got a book club going in the Discord, the girlies do, because we're excited for it. So if you want to learn more about these people and their backgrounds, we're going to have their fuller versions on Substack. And we've got some of the core team here as well. Our tech lead was not able to join us today, but we do have Aaron, who is our robot whisperer and DevOps mastermind. If there's any questions about infrastructure that come up, he'll be able to touch on those. We've got Casey Lammers, our financial steward, who's done a little bit of legwork looking into PBC, DAO, some things that might make sense. And then we've got Katie Mead, our design and product steward. But for the most part, just kind of an organic conversation, and we'll see where this takes us. So let's start with the where. There are a lot of people concerned that the US has been on a steady march towards this kind of centralization of power for the last 20 years, regardless of who's in office. It begs the question, is the United States the safest place to incorporate for what it is we're trying to build? On one hand, we may be at the whims of whatever US agencies. On the other hand, TikTok is being banned on the grounds of it being foreign owned because the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act. What might our options be if we are seeking to create a social media platform that is decentralized, distributed, and democratized? Essentially, we're seeking to build something unfuckwithable so that it cannot be messed with by billionaires or political agendas or government overreach. Not all at once.
Well, so I'll start, I guess. I think so there obviously needs to be some type of legal structure, legal entity structure for this, something like this, right? And I think you laid out some different options in your email, or some possible different options. And I tend to think that the United States is still a very, very strong place for something like this. I think you have the most access to funding here in the United States if we were going to pursue that route. And you have a lot of opportunity here that you don't have in other countries, even in other countries that may have, for example, better corporate tax rates or things like that, like Ireland. So the United States there's a lot of ways you can still do what you want to do here. And I think it becomes easier to do it here, particularly if you need something like funding. And Mike, I don't know how far you've gone down the funding rabbit trail and what you've done. I haven't done a deep dive into your world yet, but you may even want to comment on that. I don't know.
Yeah, okay. So, there is a lot of advantages for the US. But when you look at Europe, Ireland sticks out because it's where the data for Europe is managed. And there's a lot of expertise in Ireland for it. The one thing that I would caution on Ireland is that it may not be the 51st state, but it's not too far from it. There's a lot of American multinationals here, and the America has a lot of influence. And when certain things happen and Facebook and Google and LinkedIn or whatever gets upset, they go to the government, and they don't get a complete ear for sure, but they have an influence here as well, and for sure. The EU commissioner right now is an Irish guy in justice, which is kind of close to this area. There's a few of the commissions that have influence on data protection. There's a French guy and the Irish guy or two. So certainly that would help from an Irish point of view. But I would think that not to dismiss the US, but then again, I think we've all trusted the US and the current system, and it hasn't worked as well as we might like. Just your comment about funding, I guess I've been very fortunate in building Allison in that I haven't raised money for 15 years. And it's really important, and it's been profitable, and it's, you know, we're very fortunate. We've grown about 30% for the last 6 years every year. So it's doing well. But being financially independent has been crucial to our social mission, because and my social mission is to try and provide free education around the world. And it's not just knowledge and skills, but self-knowledge, psychometrics, and all that sort of stuff. And that kind of gets me thinking of, is misinformation another way of disempowerment? And our mission is empowerment generally. And that gets me interested in this whole area. But I think you can't disconnect the legal structure from the financial foundation that you're going to have. The two are very, very connected. So I'm an Ashoka fellow worldwide. I don't know if you're familiar with Ashoka. It's a social entrepreneurship network. But I don't, you know, there's 4,000 social entrepreneur Ashoka fellows. I don't know if there's a handful of organizations that have grown like ours, like we've nearly 200 staff, that are that independent and are still socially focused. So I think our example is an interesting one for anyone looking at this area. But the one other thing that I would say to you is, and I was saying this a few days ago, is that I possibly would have created Allison as a charity to begin with, because it's very socially driven, but actually didn't have enough money to actually set it up as a charity at the time, and so we run it as a for-profit social enterprise. Mm-hmm. That works well because I'm in command. I do have investors. They came in 15 years ago, but they are a minority, and I'm a majority shareholder. So that's really, really helpful. But I have run charities as well, and the one thing about charities versus the despotic dictatorship that I have, or the benevolent dictator that I am, I guess, within Allison today, is that within charities, it's so hard to work with volunteers. Mm-hmm. And you just do not have like the military, line of command that you have in a business. And this is one of the dilemmas I think that's behind this idea. It's a powerful idea, and there's a lot of it that obviously a lot of the aspects that you've mentioned are very attractive. But the legal entity, the business model, and the structure of organizing and the governance and who's in control, I have not seen any charities that really run efficiently without people being absolutely paid the going rate for doing what they do. And within Allison, a lot of people and most people are at Allison really love the social mission and are there for that. But if I stop paying them a good commercial rate every day, mm-hmm. who knows who would stay? But I'm able to do that. So
and I'll jump on that.
There.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of that, because I know one of the options that was floating around out there was potentially doing a charity or nonprofit or something in that vein. And so obviously the advantages, let's just take in the United States, for example, of doing a nonprofit. One of the big advantages is the mission focus, but also that you don't have to pay federal income tax if you're a 501c3 nonprofit, which is a type of nonprofit. The disadvantage, though, on top of what Mike was saying, is there's two of them that relate to what we're trying to do potentially. Number one is you can't have, owners or shareholders or whatever you want to call them of a nonprofit. So you can't distribute profits in the same way that a for-profit company could in a nonprofit. And I think part of your vision for this was to be able to somehow distribute some sort of profit or whatever you want to call that. There's different avenues to do that to creators. So that's one issue. The second would be that the government's very involved in nonprofits. So both from the state government perspective and the federal government perspective from the tax side, they're going to be incredibly involved. You're going to be submitting things every single year. The administrative oversight of nonprofits is going to be much heavier than it would be for a lot of for-profits, particularly in the early stages. And so I wonder if that would almost be counter to what we're trying to do a little bit, just with the involvement and the oversight, if that makes sense. Because even from the state level, like the attorney general of every state, regardless where you sign, they keep a pretty tight eye on a lot of what nonprofits are doing, and they could stick their nose in a lot of things very early and often.
Yeah.
Were you guys familiar with, or have you talked about or looked at the idea of breaking this into multiple entities? For example, what we were hoping to do was to maybe potentially do a B Corp, so it stays mission aligned, and run the creator programs, et cetera, through that. And then having a 501c or some sort of similar nonprofit entity and running the amount that the DAO or there's actually 3 structures we're looking at, that the DAO votes on how that gets spent. We would transfer that over to the nonprofit, and then the nonprofit would then distribute those funds however that looks, right? And with that separation of those specific functions for each entity give us maximum tax benefits. Obviously, there would still be government oversight, but with the money going in there, truly just being a pass-through for that money to be spent on community resources, would that give us kind of a multifaceted layer of benefits from each perspective?
I think Sam has some expertise in that area as far as DAOs, and you said that they spin up nonprofits alongside them.
Yeah, I mean, I have quite a long journey. I was listening and taking it all in. So kind of 2 self-funded companies. So I believe in the financial autonomy. I would not recommend venture capital at all. I did then 2 companies that were the traditional, I'd say one that was traditional Silicon Valley VC, and then one that was actually in 2020, kind of similar to this. So based in London, a board member at Deutsche Telekom wanted to bring together the founders of the Android operating system to create a global video-based user-owned communication platform. And I was tapped to be the CEO. I had come from the blockchain space. I was quite early in it. I was involved in not creating the first DAO, but submitting a proposal to it. And I was pretty familiar with the governance of that platform, and then the subsequent experiments that we've seen over the years, and I kind of lurk in quite a few. Where I have gotten in my career, and some of the advice I've given to people, which I've not heard here because it's a bit extreme, is like a full level of decentralization, in that there's not really an entity at all. So everyone I work with is an LLC, individual, single member, in this kind of amorphous global blob. Now, you can't do that for 200 million or 500 million or 2 billion people. And I'm the resident futurist here, sitting here thinking, like, you got to put stuff in space, like make this the first out of jurisdiction situation. We do have people, right, in the current world that we live in, that are owning most of the satellite infrastructure. But to bring it back down to earth, I think some sort of combination that you're describing, where, our model was 1 user, 1 share, 1 vote, right? For the creator, I don't like the word user. We called them members, but, some sort of terminology for people on a platform. In that situation, right? Complete direct democracy, there really wasn't a steward or custodian, but there was a governance entity that, of course, would be the steward of the platform, the infrastructure. And the DAO could vote on things like, hey, like, I don't want to pick on Katie, but like, hey, is Katie still doing it? Whatever, like, can you report on that? And people have ideas and can talk to you. So of course it can't be fully decentralized, but I think some sort of combination model that you're describing, where, there is a DAO for the participation on the platform, and that's tokenized, because there's no real way to do this. What happened to us with the London-based company, so again, was pretty old school mentality, and it got too far. I was brought in after they had already raised some funding. So the governance was messed up. I don't want to say, but you can't really roll that back. And so they were like, let's IPO to the users. I was like, what? We're going to form entities and 100 countries? Like, what are we talking about? And we were down that rabbit hole. So you're on the right track, I'd say, of thinking through it now. And I would only urge the people on this call to kind of think outside of your comfort zone of what's been done before, not in a way that like I'm suggesting regulatory or legal ambiguity. That's something I do not advocate for, but something that at least is thinking about the members or the creators on this platform first and foremost in the way that you want to design that, and then creating the governance around that. Seems like that's the nucleus of the idea here, right? Is owned and governed by the people. So what is that? And then what supports that model? Not so much like none of you or none of us here are important because you are and are making this happen, but I'd say my experience in DAO projects, which were similar to ICOs and all the crap that happened with NFTs and now with meme coins, you know, they're usually designed to create some sort of token pool that heavily rewards the folks who'd probably be like us on this call. And that's fair, I suppose, but most of them were not. So really doing it and kind of urging really to like align to those values from day one would be kind of interesting to see. And I think very successful.
I really, sorry, and I just want to jump in there, Sam, really quick. I really like the idea of like the DAO LLC combo. So basically like you have, and there's states that allow, I think Wyoming was the first, but you can have you can create an LLC where you register with the Secretary of State. Wyoming's great for businesses. And then, but then everything is governed via tokens, right? So you have the tokens and all decisions are made. And so you have an operating agreement that's very like token centric. And you don't even have to have a management class within that LLC in this sense of like a traditional board of managers or anything. You can have all management decisions in smart contracts, right? So, and that's all just written into the operating agreement. And I think, I'll just say, like, I think for what we're trying to do, that does make some sense. And so I really like that idea and that combo. So sorry, go ahead. I think Katie, you maybe were trying to say something.
Yeah, looking into some of the like product planning for the DAO element to this, it being sort of like a hybrid model of at least two decentralized things. So we have AT protocol, which is running the sort of app interface experience for users and members, and then the DAO for the governance aspect. Sam, what you're saying about tokens often being allocated to founders or investors, there's a way of setting it up so that isn't the case at all. So 50% of the tokens are reserved, or some percentage that we establish are reserved for the DAO treasury, which is entirely community governed. And that then makes grants essentially voted on by the community to contributors or early founders or something, so that it isn't, I don't know if you even need a pass through in that case. I think in that case, you're actually, as long as everyone is able to kind of operate in Web3 and on the blockchain, the other entities are not required.
Mm-hmm.
Matt, I think this might sort of mesh with what you're saying about the LLC and DAO structure.
Yeah, so I think we have to think through. So you're saying that maybe we don't even need the LLC concept. Everything's done on the blockchain. There's nothing, the interface is at the entity level in the respect of what we would think of as a legal entity outside the blockchain.
But yeah, well, my question, I'm just going to say then who or what owns the IP? Do we need that? I mean, this was a debate we had where we even chose a name that you couldn't possibly own. The platform was named Love. You can't own that as IP. And these were some very smart people. I was just the little face of this thing, but you know, I was these debates, right? Is like, does in a model in the future, does that exist, or can that exist on chain? We all know it can exist on chain, but we live in a world that still operates within legal structures. You know, or is it seen if it does not have some sort of established structure? does it become the enemy of the powers that be, you know, and get flagged? So
It is a good question about the IP. This is Aaron on the infrastructure side. Sorry, no video. Thought I'd interject. I think the code that we are basing all of this stuff on is on the MIT license, and as such, everything that we build off of it also would need to be on the MIT license, open source.
Interesting.
And
Mike,
I one other question, and it's not really necessarily about governance, but it has been brought up and it is something on our mind. You know, if this does spark the interest of our government, say, for example, are there any protections that are offered by any of these potential entity types that would make it easier for us, better for us?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, so the whole point of an LLC, for example, is to limit the liability of the owners and the members. So you're basically, you know, when you're forming an LLC, you're basically saying, like, if we run our business through the LLC, then the only thing that can be liable for, like, the debts of the business or those types of things is the entity itself, so the LLC, and not the individual members or owners of the entity. So that's the limited liability protection. I think that even if to talk to Eric, I think there will, and maybe I'm just not thinking big enough, Sam, and please call me out if I'm not. I mean, I'm serious. I you think about this stuff way more than I do, but I think I'll just call it real world. I know Web3 is real world too, but you know what I mean when I say that. So in the real world, I think there does have to be, at least at the outset, some entity ownership of some things. So there has to be a separate thing from the owners themselves that owns things like there's a million different types of IP, right? So like different types of IP, even IP outside the code. I would think that there would also need to be some type of entity that is potentially entering into different contracts or agreements with third parties. And that could be something as simple as banks, but that could also be other things that the entity is involved in, where you obviously wouldn't want individual owners or all the owners signing off on X, Y, or Z. You'd want an entity. And to me, if you are going to have an entity, it makes sense to have an entity that has those limited liability protections, i.e. either a LLC, a corporation, C Corp, or B Corp, right? So I'm trying to think of like a scenario where it's disadvantageous to have an LLC in a situation like this. Does that make sense? Like, I'm trying to think of a reason that we wouldn't have at least some type of entity at the outset.
Well, can you explain for me the difference in the protections or the benefits of an LLC versus, say, a B Corp?
Yeah. So both are for-profit entities. So admittedly, I don't have a ton of experience with B Corps personally. I mostly work with LLCs, nonprofits, and C Corps, but they're the liability protections would be very, very similar. So essentially, when LLCs were created, they were created to combine the limited liability protections of a corporation with the tax advantages of a non-corporation, basically. So LLCs are pass-through entities in the sense that the IRS disregards them, and all of the income flows through to the owners of the LLC, who then report that income on their personal tax returns. Or sometimes the owners are other LLCs, which in that case it goes through those LLCs to those individual owners, right? So like the B Corp would function from a governance perspective more like a corporation. But would also have that and Mike, you may know the term better than I do, but that social benefit component. So it's a for-profit that has almost that like nonprofit mission attached, if that makes sense.
The B Corp is the one you're talking about?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, because and I don't know any of this. This is all just my rambling research, but from the research that I did, it seemed like B Corp might be the route to go. And so I just want to understand if that's not the route to go and we go with LLC, the why behind it, so that we can maximize whatever those benefits are.
I wonder if you could build the social benefit side of the B Corp into the LLC. Like essentially you could into its governing documents, like an operating agreement, you could map that into it, because an LLC can do whatever it wants, basically, within its, and it can govern itself however it wants. So the LLC to me offers more flexibility than a B Corp, especially if you're going to try to combine it, kind of do it with a DAO, for example, type feel.
Would the LLC be like an owner? Would that be how it kind of functions? Like the LLC is like an owner of? Is that what you mean?
I mean that the LLC would be the main operating entity for the venture, essentially.
And
So
the
it
B Corp
would be,
would own? Or
say
they,
it again.
and would the B Corp own it, or they don't own each other? They just operate
No, I
alone,
mean,
right?
like, those would be totally separate to me. Like, you have to, I would say, choose either or for like the ownership of the, like, what would be running the actual entity, right? Or what the actual entity would be. Now, that's not to say, to Sam's point earlier, which I thought was a good point, that's not to say any individual owner or member of the company, right? They could all choose, they could all own their tokens through another LLC. You know what I mean? Like, they're almost not unlimited, but there's many different levels you could go underneath that, and people can make their own decisions as far as how they're owning their individual units, tokens, whatever you want to call them. But yeah, I would say you're probably not running both from the outset. I would say you're kind of choosing a lane from my perspective.
Mike, how does Allison do it? Is it a B Corp, an LLC? I'm curious because obviously for profit, but then you've got a really strong social mission that you've done so right. And I'm just curious, like, what that looks like on the entity side.
Oh, it's really simple. It's a for-profit company, but I've had it 20 years and I've never taken a penny out of it. I've always reinvested it into trying to have more and more social impact. So it's unusual. It's around a person, me, and so it's not as appropriate. It's not appropriate to what we're trying to do here. This is much bigger than one person off on a mission. But I just, if I can go back to the entity is in some ways going to be determined on the financial model. And, you know, one thing that we toyed with is, could you go direct to a listing for a startup here with an LLC? Because if you're crowdfunding, you know, some of the larger exchanges, if you got enough noise out there, might be interested. And can you bypass all of these early stages, these, you know, the early venture capital? Can you make this a consumer funded entity? I don't know what experience you have there, Matthew, but in that way, I don't know of any other entity that actually was successful in doing that. But this is big enough; it can capture a lot of imagination. It's very consumer orientated. It's very public orientated. There's a lot of people out there that are very dissatisfied with what has happened. Could they put their hand in their pocket for $100, $200, and could you get 50 million people to do that? And that's, you know, I think you need to think differently, as Sam was inviting us to do, of how what could happen here.
I mean, this is like Reg A plus or Reg D. Are you familiar with these filings, at least in the U.S.? So in 2017, there, at least in like the crypto, I'm reluctant to use that word. I was never crypto. I built blockchain infrastructure. But, you know, with every new protocol, there are always people doing really creative things just like this. So that was basically the idea was, could we go do a token sale, right, to people and get them kind of from the beginning? And actually the US from the regulatory standpoint did catch up and created a few scenarios, right? Like regulatory guidance to do crowdfunding at scale or kind of IPO from the beginning. But I think anything bigger, it's been so long since I've done it, but a lot of people are in jail is what I will say, who have gone down this path. So that's like my more extreme example. My fear, right? Because I like to consider that if I made it through that industry still intact with my ethics, like I'm a pretty ethical person, never really tiptoed into that area. It might be pushing into a gray zone that, because it could be successful, is exactly when the eyes of regulators or people would probably be upset by that. Now, particularly in the US, it seems like there are some backdoor deals and things happening with TikTok, right? We don't know fully who is going to benefit from this, what's happening. And so there it might not be something that people necessarily want this to succeed, and there could be eyes on it. You know, you get a whole movement of people around the world and raise $1 billion. Like, I don't know, it probably still worth it to do. But I like the idea. And then on the point, Matt, about LLCs, I would probably advocate more for the simplest structure to start. B Corps, I have some experience. I've almost created B Corp entities in the past, never went through with it. I was part of a network that was a B Corp, and they definitely were not acting in line with their values. To me, it kind of feels like some form of greenwashing. And they might not even have like so much of a good reputation these days as a structure, because you can, as Matt said, in the operating agreement or the values or the bylaws, say like, this is what we believe in, right? Whatever that means in terms of the community governance or the impact on the world, and then just live by that and have a social impact. So, I wouldn't get caught up in structures that, kind of try to bring in the social element. And I would also agree with for-profit. There's just more flexibility in those structures.
And just because you're for profit doesn't mean you have to actually make money. You could give away every dollar you wanted, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm
an LLC, and it all goes, it's I tried to do, like, again, especially in the US right now with the nonprofits, all these status and kind of people going after NGOs and all of that there's just a lot more scrutiny, and you can choose what you want, right? You can build into the company the way that it's going to handle governance or the treasury, and let people decide that.
Yeah, the only reason for potentially having a nonprofit on the side would be to simply sweep profit from the for-profit corporation to be dispersed through the nonprofit by way of, or in order to, I guess, avoid the taxes on those, to maximize the tax savings on the part that will specifically and definitely go back to community resources, and remain the rest of it remaining in the LLC or whichever entity is the for-profit. Does that work, or are there downsides to doing it that way?
Isn't that mostly the structure? Again, it's been quite many years since I've been kind of deep into Web3 or crypto, but a lot of them were kind of split in that way, right? Foundations and some sort of service. I mean, even one of my past companies did this. There was a nonprofit arm that was the custodian of the decentralized network. And then there was the service provider entity, right? It was a C Corp, not an LLC, but same general idea. And it contracted with the foundation to provide those services. But that the difference there, where this can get kind of sketchy, is if there's not adequate governance in the foundation, of the members that are choosing who those service providers are, then it kind of turns a little wonky. So again, that's where it would be essential that there's voting on the use of the treasury and the allocation of funds.
If you don't mind me interjecting here, I'm listening to this conversation, and it strikes me as so similar to the conversation in Plato's Republic.
Yeah.
How do you organize an entity to be completely benevolent? Like Mike is that benevolent dictator, right? That they're talking about in that entire story. And who watches the watchers is the question that you guys are grappling with right now.
Mm-hmm. I've not seen anything successful yet to answer that question of that long held, however many thousands of years we've gotten.
You're right. To be fair, they were asking it thousands.
You're a DevOps person. I'm not like anti-smart contract either. I obviously built these things, but I don't think the end game is like, just a smart contract will solve this problem. So it's important to have the conversations and do the best that we can.
Sorry, Sam. Can I just on the comment about profitability and the want to be able to have a door for the profits to go somewhere else? I assure you, it's very easy to get rid of profits. Within Allison, what we found, so we became profitable and whatever, is I started funding interesting programs. We funded a Northern Ireland Protestant Catholic schools program, trying to get kids talking on both sides of the border, that type of thing, because I knew that I had the space of profit to do it. So you go off and you do a social impact program. It got rid of that amount of profit, but you had the social impact. So I think the idea of having a vent or a valve for profits to make sure that it can go somewhere else, no, is my view. Keep it within the entity and spend it well, and just always keep below, just keep the money within the entity for as long as it lasts. I mean,
Well, I guess
like all entities, this will not be forever.
because you would still get the tax benefit because it would show up as an expense.
That would
So
be an
you-
expense.
Yeah, so you wouldn't be paying taxes anyways, is what you're saying. So there's not really a need to go through the nonprofit.
Yeah, it's just a perspective.
No, I appreciate that.
Yeah, and you're not inviting scrutiny, which nonprofits have a lot more scrutiny from the government, and you're filing Form 990s every year, at least in the United States. I mean, every country probably has different, but it just, there's just a lot more freedom in a for-profit entity, which maybe looks backwards, but I guess the rationale from the government side is, hey, if we're going to give you this big of tax break, we're going to better see where your money's going. So
Yeah.
Well, and that's and Kiara has heard my little spiel on that I feel like private organizations should have to be able to substantiate and pass audits with the same regulatory guidance as these other entities, but that's my own personal. So, audits and forms, that's not a deterrent necessarily for me, because I hope that we will be putting in place systems and processes robust enough that that's not really a concern. However, if we don't need it at all to avoid the extra work, certainly makes sense. Yeah.
One other protection of the LLC is competition legislation. So if you form yourselves and you say that you're this oddest of entities, and that it's somewhat unusual and it's socially focused, people look at it differently. If you went on the other side and you said, hey, here we are taking on Facebook, TikTok in good old American competitiveness, hey, what are you looking at us for? We're just trying to compete like the next guy. Isn't that what America's all about? There's a lot of legislation that supports people who are competing. And maybe you try to use that as a strength rather than try and stay this. You're still social in terms of the governance and all that, but use a little bit of judo. Use what is out there to try and make you stronger a bit. Yeah.
To add to that, which is kind of funny, you make me laugh. Our entity was in the UK, right? And the idea, though, was to take on the American companies on American turf, hence the American CEO that was brought in to do that. Like, I actually would be in favor of, I think this should be on US soil. If you're going to do it, you got to kind of go for it on our home turf. And actually the Wyoming or Delaware DAO, right, at least they have structures or provisions for those in those two states from the last I checked. That would be a good way to do it, and also advance or influence the regulatory guidelines as this evolves. But I like the idea of, good old competition on the home turf. Not that TikTok is necessarily the American home turf, but they've
it might be soon. Yeah.
that might be a totally different thing. We've got to go in the opposite direction. But I think very interesting.
I think if you're going to aim, you might as well aim high.
Mm.
The other advantage to an LLC in this context, I think, would be to having the actual entity be an LLC, is that like in Wyoming, for example, there's really strong protection against creditors. And what I mean by that is if a specific, so like if we're really going to say that everyone who is a creator on this platform is going to be potentially a member or an owner, which it sounds like that might be the direction that we're going, then you have potentially millions, right, of different owners, right? And so what you want to make sure is that everyone's liability is like separated out from each other. So in an LLC, there's a really elegant way that that's done. It's through something called charging order protection, which means that like in Wyoming, has really great protections for this. So like if let's say Sam is a member of the LLC and she has, really bad debts and a bunch of creditors going after her for some reason, the only remedy for that creditor as to her membership in the LLC is to collect distributions from the LLC on her behalf if the LLC gives distributions. So
Like
it's
garnish it, kind of like pull
kind
it.
of, yeah, like it's basically like a garnishment of wages, except a garnishment of her distributions. And that's the sole remedy for a creditor as to her interest in the LLC, right? And that's awesome, not only for the protection of the entity itself, but also for the protection of every other member of the LLC, of which there will be potentially millions. And so the LLC also has the ability to ebb and flow what they're giving as distributions, depending on, there can be some strategy things there. But my point is that they have probably the strongest charging order protection in the nation, not just because of the entity, but because of the state, because states have varying degrees typically.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's great to know. Other thoughts, considerations? So it sounds like, if I'm understanding this correctly, it sounds like we're thinking an LLC alongside a DAO. Is that right? And the question is for whether or not it remains on American soil, kind of remains to be seen. It sounds like that direction might make sense, although I like a lot of what Mike said about Ireland. So
I am going to bring up something about data locality, because I feel like Adam would have brought this up as well. So take like Ireland, for example, and Europe's general GDPR regulations. There are some places where you must have the data local. Are there any considerations for where the entity is formed or anything like that that have to do with ownership of that data in those different jurisdictions?
So I don't know. That's actually going to be a great question for Adam. I know that there was something that was said in the Slack the other day. I think he said it, that some data cannot legally be hosted in the US, and given recent political developments, this concern might grow, right? So the team
Exactly.
needs to be aware of future-proofing their infrastructure decisions there.
Right. I'm just asking if there's anything about ownership of those things, because, take as for an example, I mean, I've been doing enterprise corporate finance for 25 years. And, we worked with all of the Fortune 500s deploying finance systems. And there are a lot of places where we had to put, like Azure has the ability to host things in specific places, and we needed to do that for certain customers. Yeah, but it was all just under the same umbrella of the company that owned that data. We just localized what was put where. So, I mean, I don't know anything about the businesses and how they were structured. So that's why I'm bringing it up.
I
Yeah.
wonder, would it be possible for one entity to be, like in Wyoming, for example, like the DAO, and the company itself to be in Ireland? Because I know Ireland doesn't have any official recognition of DAOs yet, or at least that's what I've seen. So is there any combination where we're maximizing benefits that way in terms of one entity in one place and one in the other?
The answer is yeah, you could certainly do that for sure. Obviously, it increases the complexity immediately of the corporate structure. So it's done all the time. They're called corporate tax inversions, and so companies move a certain percentage of their business, particularly IP, because it's easy to move to a country like Ireland with a lower corporate tax rate. So I think, what's Ireland at now, Mike? 12.5, something in that ballpark?
15.
15.
15, yeah.
Yeah, and so US, boy, it's varied in recent decades, but it's what, 21% now. And I think when Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed in his first term, that was a permanent. The corporate tax rate was permanent. Now it can be changed, obviously, by legislation, but the point is that you can have some tax advantages to that, but you're going to typically, to show that, to get that tax advantage, you're going to have to show that a substantial part of your operations are based in that country, or a substantial part of the the locus of your company more or less is over there. And so now a lot of companies have done that. Mike mentioned a lot of American companies have used Ireland as a tax base because of its favorable tax policies. So it just creates a little bit more that you're going to have to show and prove and essentially show that you're not just using that to take advantage of the tax situation. I know that's a lot. It's a complicated area, but it can be done for sure.
I think like half of our team already volunteered to move to Ireland when that came up. So based on the Discord, like we might be okay there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Not a lot of housing here, but anyway, we'll figure it out. But one thing that we're finding through the Allison business is definitely there's you had this globalization or surge in the last few decades, but for data protection, particularly what's gone on in the last week or two, the EU at the highest level is making a decision not to be an American digital colony anymore. So when you're signing on, literally for any service in Europe, you're asked, do you want to sign in through Google, Facebook? That's going to change, and it's going to change in India as well. Yeah. And you see it in taxation. So Allison has revenue coming from every country in the world, but you've countries like Tanzania now standing up and saying, hey, you're selling product in our country, you need to register here. And Kenya is doing the same, Uganda. So I think you're going to see blocks, 5 to 6 big blocks around the world where you're going to have an independent data strategy. And that data for those areas is going to have to be hosted locally. So again, this goes back to the business model. It's just how ambitious are we looking to be? Is this an American platform? Is it a global platform? I think we all agree it's a global platform. If that's the case, has a lot of technical implications, legal implications, data implications, and the original structure from legal is just one of them. But obviously, it's one that needs to be sorted out at the beginning. But the world is changing in the sense of getting a lot more regulated in regional groups. And the politics is driving it that way.
Yeah, great points.
And I will say this, just to ease everyone's concerns a bit on the legal structure, it's all changeable for the most part. So in other words, if we started out as an LLC or something in Wyoming, just LLC DAO combo or whatever, you can always convert down the road. Now, sometimes there are consequences to the conversion to like a corporation or whatever, but companies do that all the time. You can also, it's called domestication, where you can domesticate to different states if you want to move. So there are consequences sometimes from a financial perspective of doing some of that, but it's all pretty, it's all pretty flexible, especially early on. So I would just point that out. And I do think one of the other big unanswered questions that was touched on, and Mike, you brought it up, I think twice now, because it's very important, is the fundraising aspect. And Sam, great points about because essentially what you're doing here kind of is you're engaging in some type of essentially a public offering here of securities, because now there may be ways that you can get around the registration in specific situations, but at the end of the day, you're saying to a ton of people, hey, buy into what we're doing here, potentially. And so there are securities law concerns around that I think we need to think through. And I guess what that would look like, or if that can fit into an exemption for securities laws. And so I'm more just placing a pin on that for us to think about, because I think that's an important consideration.
And I do think I think we are all in alignment of we definitely don't want to take, it's going to be crowd funded if we can, through individual contributors and no equity in return, other than this amazing potential idea to have in your life. So I think in terms of we don't really have to so much worry about the other types of ways we're going to raise funds. I hope, of course, we don't know the future and what this will look like, but I think the hope of all of us is that we take money out of the equation in terms of any sort of ownership, and that we really raise this off of the users.
Yeah, I think the only way this works is if it's entirely grassroots. VC obviously comes with strings, and that's not going to work for what it is we're trying to do. I think at the least we would need to divorce financial stakes from governance, but I think we can definitely prevent it from being hijacked by anything for profit if we just eliminate the equity piece altogether. So kind of remains to be seen. And I don't know if can you do that with an LLC? I mean, I guess you can do anything with an LLC, but
Well, just so I'm understanding, so yeah, it's very easy with an LLC to separate decision-making power from economic benefit. LLCs do that all the time. However, my question is still, was it Casey? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Casey, you're saying that people would, so when you say crowdfunding, you're saying that people would crowdfund the venture, but not receive equity in the venture.
Correct. Yeah. I mean,
you use language like a donation or a subscription, for legality's sake, but is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a portion of this that really is truly like funds donated, right? Initially, but then yes, through the use of the platform, for example, I mean, when you step back and you look at TikTok, they're literally, crowdfunding, not equity crowdfunding. When you look at pull back from TikTok, what they're actually doing is making money off of the interactions of the users. So there will be an element of that, right? Like we want products to be available. There's going to be fees for buying and selling products, but the difference being like in those instances, the users are essentially quote unquote paying, right? Paying into the system, but they're not necessarily donating at that point. They're just interfacing with it and creating the revenue themselves through the interactions. And we also hope, I think, to give back, such a small portion of the revenue actually goes into the hands of the users. We'd like to change that as well. Not just the people who are posting videos and social media influencers or selling items, but even the ones purchasing items and watching videos, having ways of rewarding them for being active users who are dedicated to using this site. So yeah, it is an interesting concept. The beginning will be, I believe, donations and such, but through subscriptions, through interactions in the platform, that is what will truly raise the funds for its operations, its everything.
Yeah, I would say it's like the MVP is what we're focused on now. That gets us to crowdfunding. And once we're to crowdfunding, like we can introduce all kinds of monetization avenues that make it profitable and can start becoming self-sustaining. I don't know if I necessarily agree on rewarding people for spending a lot of time on the app. I feel like that's encouraging screen addiction, but we can have that conversation potentially another day. Aaron, were you going to say something?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, first example of creators demonstrating things on the platform would be me streaming writing code for the platform for donations.
I love that. Cool. All right, I know we're coming up on time here. Want to honor everyone's time. Any last things? Anything else?
Just one comment, if I might, just of how Allison works. 85% of people on Allison don't give us anything. And we make the business model work because we have volume. Because we have about 300,000 people on the platform every day, the average amount of money that people leave us is in the cents, okay? And my point here is, if you can get enough volume and enough people to get engaged with the platform, and with the advances in technology, you can keep the costs really, really low. And that's all about the crowd. So, and especially if you don't have this mammoth task to make money and to be listed and to be more profitable tomorrow and the next day and whatever, you can run the business in a very different way. You can really grow it for impact and at the same time stay commercially attractive. So I just think there's business models that are coming about. Allison just being one of them, and I talk about it because I know it best. But I think that we're at the beginning of the emergence of social businesses, and we all want them,
Mhm.
and they're starting to peek their head up. But I'd love one of the part of being involved in this conversation is can we bring that forward and get other examples out there so people can see that it can be done. Yeah,
For sure.
I love the term social business. Like that just really made me smile.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. This was a very inspiring and informative conversation. Thank you so much for your time. We'll follow up with some items over email, and thank you for being part of our ecosystem.
So grateful.
Thank you.
thanks guys.
Bye,
Take
guys.
care.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye now.
you.
Thank you for all you're doing.
Bye.